72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later. 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... the next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea.
5,000 celebrities later.
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later. Montage. Many unbearable hours later. 3 days later. 15 minutes later. Thousands of tears later. Several months later. 2 very boring minutes later. Approximately 10 hours later. The following day. 2 weeks later. 5 minutes later. A lot of boring math later.
Time only.
Flash. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how it's shaping up.
Obviously.
Yesterday. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. Meanwhile, at a few moments later. 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 Later.
Later.
Later. In the void. Later. 1 minute later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Hours later. 346 minutes later. 8 hours later.
9 hours later.
Approximately 10 hours later. Several song-filled hours later. Many hours later.
Many hours of fun time later.
Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later.